Hello everyone, today we talk about kingdoms and territorial states in Northern and Eastern Europe. Recently I made some videos about both the northern monarchies and also I created a playlist on medieval Russia. I made another video that is something like Eastern European monarchies, talking specifically about Bohemia, Poland and Hungary, even though you can call them some sort of Central European, not necessarily Eastern, but this is merely conventional. It has no deeper meaning. And today I would like to approach the topic from a comprehensive perspective, which is even kind of more generalist, as you understand that in those other videos. I admit I don't like very much to have this kind of approaches, because I believe also as a medievalist that there should be a clear and detailed focus on in each one of these entities that hopefully on Schwerpunkt we will do in the future. Bear in mind that what we are doing now is just a general introduction. It's as if you were reading a manual of medieval history the first year of university. That is to say, something very even superficial, if you want, compared to what is should really at least be known. And I say this also not to confuse people excessively about the contents. This is probably gonna be a video that will not increase enormously your awareness about these countries if you already know them and their medieval history in some detail. But at the same time, I think it's important to talk about them, first of all, because it's for obvious reasons. Medieval history is mostly concentrated what we can in Southern and Western Europe, and for the sheer development, the strength of especially the states that were developed in there. And that's why this broader crescent stretching from Norway up to the Black Sea in the south east is substantially forgotten, but there are certain structural reasons for this, and it's important to highlight them particularly. And also, obviously, we can't talk about every single entity, so this is not going to be, first of all, even a focus or a list of all the various countries, because this is not the point, but really trying to get an overlook about the main characteristics and features that that made these kingdoms the way they were, right? So why is there, I don't know, there is no this little principality or no, this other, it's not the point of the video, and we will definitely talk about those issues, I believe, and chiefly in from, at least temporarily speaking, I think we will deal with them before through military history, then through this series of more generalist videos. I have no idea of how much it's gonna take. Really, I think that before getting a solid stratum of all these generalistic videos, we will spend a couple of years if I continue with this rhythm. So nothing is granted, but after that we should be able to move on. So after this brief and boring introduction, let's pass to the topic proper. So basically, the tendency to the affirmation of monarchic institutions in Europe between the 14th and the 15th century definitely comprehended also the territories of this kind of outskirts of the West, right? Maybe I realize that maybe this is not one of the best definitions, but really it's important to understand also from which directions medieval civilization was coming from, right? Europe was not all equal; it was all different, just like today. And from the ancient world, if you really want to fill this millenary gap between the ancient world and the modern age, but even beyond, because this differences actually lasted longer, you have to understand that fundamentally civilization was pouring from more developed areas, chiefly the Mediterranean or other regions of Western Europe or Southeastern Europe that had been more developed, more advanced. sometimes deeply either Hellenized or Romanized, and that eventually expanded this great. And these forms of basically of management of political and social structures that took a lot of time, in fact, during the Middle Ages to develop, right? Take lands like, I don't know, take Germany from the end of the ancient world, what it was like, and think of what it was, in fact, 1,000 years after, at the thresholds of the modern age, right? You have basically a wasteland, or almost, let's say, even though maybe Roman historiographers made some sort of that they exaggerated certain cases, but actually we see it from many macroscopical evidence, a quantity of evidence that Germany was what it was, like the third world. After 1,000 years, it was basically the most technologically advanced land in Europe, together with Italy, for example. So filling this gap that you see from a region that was the center of the Roman Empire, like Italy, to Germany, that was kind of one of the most underdeveloped areas, that was filled, right? So what happened in as a gap? So what happened in the between, naturally, is particularly important. So this you can see this broader direction really in this geographical perspective, because at the end of the day, it's also an environmental reason, right? The take latitude, temperatures. It's obvious that in order to make function something in Northern Europe, it takes a freaking lot of time for medieval technological standards than making it work in the Mediterranean. The same goes in part with other, with, for example, the difference between Atlantic and continental climate, between, let's say, Western and Central Eastern Europe. So these were massive differences. Really make a lot of difference, especially in the crop rate, in all the. It's really a physical point in the question. You need more calories to burn to make things work, because the temperature is cooler. And I realized that if you never got this perspective, it can sound kind of weird to hear, and especially if you as many people do, you believe that the Middle Ages were an homogeneous flatland of darkness where nothing important happened, or where there weren't structures or dynamic systems, etc. This is instead a pretty evident reality. And this is something you can also see far beyond the Middle Ages in itself. I mean, the differences between especially Western and Eastern Europe proper are pretty evident. And not just today after the Cold War, but and communism in the East, but also take in general what, it could have been the Roman Empire, feudalism, but in general also these environmental factors that made this broader area of the East, especially the North, also had this quite difficult development to lag behind, right? Today we look at countries like the Scandinavian ones, we say, oh wow, those are some of the most advanced in the world, or the wealthiest, etc. But up to really a few centuries before, it wasn't really like that. I mean, there were sound differences deriving from this big structural environmental conditions to be taken into consideration. So today we are talking about this huge area that stretches, in fact, as we have seen, from Scandinavia to the wide plains inhabited by the Slavic peoples, and to make a comparison with southwestern Europe, we have obviously to note that with a few exceptions, though, that kind of confirmed the rule, the monarchies that arose and established themselves were weaker than in the rest of Europe, like in the southwest. They were basically less socially and politically articulated. They were basically devoid of an administrative organization based on royal functionaries, right? And that's a pretty powerful indicator. It's not a matter of, a monarchy deciding not to use royal functionaries for some cultural reasons. The problem is that in order to have royal functionaries, you need, first of all, enough resources to make them operate, to make them being effective. If the monarchy is not so strong that it has even to struggle to remain afloat within its own boundaries, well, you're not probably going to do much with royal functionaries in the first place. Maybe it's better if you concentrate in the army, although that was a necessity also of the other monarchies. So in these northeastern monarchies, the backbone was represented, institutionally speaking, by the relations that were established between the sovereigns and the nobility. Right, this was really the real alternative at this point. It's as we often say on Schwerpunkt, this centralized state entities were all based on clienterly relations. Right, it was like they were all over before really the nation state. It was just like a great mobster state, let's say, where there is a series of dependencies based on power and strength, and this clienterly system that naturally is very fluid, right? Is very unstable in many ways because it doesn't have a fixed center. Right, it doesn't. Even here it's meant even literally, like take the concept of the modern concept of capital. Right, there were naturally important cities at this point everywhere in Europe that would become the naturally capitals of modern European countries that started even from those times naturally to develop. But even here, the concept of a capital, that is a place from which the king rules, basically, is something pretty unknown, right? The really the kingdom that started this the earliest is really England. London is much older and truer capital than even in cities like Paris, for example, or even Rome, that had all different, or Vienna, for example. It took really a lot of time before this thing started, and this is particularly evident, especially in the northeast. However, where there were great centers that were still catalyzing the process of monarchical structuration in a way or in another. We will observe today, for example, the Muscovy, right? For example, that starts where Moscow is still today the Russian capital. It started from there, but at one point, as you know, in the 18th century, the capital really was St. Petersburg. Also in there, changes were there. The capital of Poland was Krakow, right? Not Warsaw. You can find many of these switches, really, and it was based exactly on the concept that the court was itinerant, and this corresponded also to political and military needs, because the king really wanted to control directly the territory this way, not exclusively telling the truth because of military threat, also because of that, but also because of tying closer relations with the local communities. That was particularly important, and trying to search for new subsidies and in exchange for this favoritism towards the local prince, the local city, etc. Really the balance, the political balance and relations of power were really largely based on this system. So the reason why this somehow went differently from southwestern Europe is that there was no engagement of other classes, let's say, especially the urban ones largely, but that obviously were present but weaker, right? Because these northeastern kingdoms largely didn't have really a complex social articulation. They were characterized fundamentally by a scarce urban development and the prevalence from, in the agricultural world of the large estate owners, right? That is the big aristocracy, the oligarchs that were actually the major opponents to the strengthening of monarchies. Like take like the monarchies we were mentioning before, like Bohemia or Poland or Hungary. I mean, the problem of the elective monarchy, that was something that really existed in theory also in the West, but was something much more let's say alive, much stronger there, because in the West, right? So talking about urban development, and now we will explain why, why. So talking about the lower degree of urbanization, this is also obvious. The greatest cities in Europe were fundamentally of Roman origin, largely at least. There were new centers developing, especially on water highways and other junctions, connections, nets of communications. But they were found, the empire had built them there exactly because locally the resources needed for such a development were largely available. Always, never forget what the boundaries of the Roman Empire were factually. That is the boundaries of sedentary system, of agriculture, of wine cultivation, of all of productions that could support the production of a sufficient surplus to maintain a regular army and cities that were fundamentally the cherry on top of, or the tip of the iceberg, if you prefer, of the great agricultural world. So when you see cities, you don't have to think before pre-industrial times. They are built over, by themselves, just by sheer trade, right? Not even those centers that had evidently a trade function, like many were during the Middle Ages, were fundamentally exclusively based or largely based on trade. They were still largely based on what the surrounding countryside could produce, right? So it's really a deep material and structural perception that you have to have when looking at these developments. And the urban classes were very precious asset in order to balance to counter the power of aristocracies, right? In every kingdom here in Europe, without distinction, to see that clever sovereigns always used the cities to counter the excessive power of the clergy, of the lay aristocracy, because they saw, let's say, some communities that couldn't really compete to the top, struggling to the top. There were very few areas in Europe where cities were effectively able to counter entire kingdoms, right? And even making them abort. But in other countries, it was normal, and it was something very ancient. It happened sometimes at a class level, even during the Roman Empire, like the emperor siding with the plebs against the senatorial oligarchy, right? To have paradoxically a more democratic rule. I mean, not much to stress. In fact, the aristocratic character and economical luxury and conservatism of the oligarchy, but actually trying to build a centralized power, right? So the key word you really have to understand in order to comprehend the balance of the ancien regime at all times, albeit with different degrees, naturally, throughout history, is balance, right? Is this idea of really not, and sometimes this is exchanged for example, for tolerance. This even with religions, for example, you can't really say that medieval Europe people were free about their religion, but at the same time, monarchs, for example, this is particularly evident in Eastern Europe. The Jewry, for example, was extremely precious because they represented the imperatorial class. They boosted the growth of certain urban centers. They were quite precious. They could give the crown cash, and they were invited in the kingdom for that. A much worse condition was the one of the peasantry, for example. There is this inherent struggle, which is very interesting, by the way, from a cultural point of view, between the monarchs that are by extraction naturally aristocrats, but the tendency to detach themselves, even dynastically, obviously for the sake of centralization, from the rest of the oligarchy, trying to back the local the local cities, or even the peasantry sometimes, and try to stem nobiliar power. This is particularly evident since a very long time. Today I didn't specify it, but we're gonna talk about the late Middle Ages. I said before the 14th, 15th century, but you can read it from the title. Have not quite said it, but these transformations can be observed really since high medieval times. I mean, ever since in Central and Eastern Europe, these monarchies rose for the first time, right? So, and even they're emerging from a system that initially really favored, in my opinion, especially in certain cases, especially in Bohemia, as far as I can remember, that in fact turned out to be a pretty efficient kingdom at this point, to counterbalance nobiliar power, essentially because these entities were evolving, let's say, from a largely tribal world. So even though aristocracies were naturally pushing towards a aristocratization of policy, a sort of centralization, which is from the base of this same ruling families and later classes of oligarchs, they were, however, tendentially weaker. Like, you can't compare, for example, in power in terms also of decentralization, the families of of France and the level of the power of the clientele, so the level of stratifications of society, with the ones of, say, the Western Slavic kingdoms. Those kingdoms had a great potential, and naturally they were starting from with many centuries in later compared to what was happening elsewhere. But in this sense, they could play a card that was trying to stem the development of the oligarchies from a monarchical position, I mean, before they became too powerful. And this struggle therefore makes things evolve in a slightly different fashion than in the West, because in the West the feudal, let's say, anarchy and chaos at a certain point emerges for all the reasons that you can't find. We made lots of videos on Frankish history usually, and you can't look at them without the need of myself repeating myself. But in the East happened in a different way. Like, initially there wasn't quite of this anarchy. At least if it existed, it was on a sort of much more tribalistic, egalitarian way, and it was rather an anarchy that was increasingly growing throughout the centuries, for which basically for political formations that actually had a pretty big potential. Think even in very late times, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, even during the modern age, at a certain point, as states, let's say, as crowns trying to centralize a bit, basically fail, because they are overwhelmed by the aristocracy that eventually takes over and makes the states, at the end of the day, collapsing, while incidentally the Westerners were instead creating now finally a modern centralized state that basically ate those other kingdoms alive, literally. Think about the partitions of Poland, just for saying once, in the late 18th century. So this is interesting because you can immediately understand how many structural differences existed between these kingdoms and the others. And what we were stressing before is also as in part as a cause and a consequence of the scarce urban development, the prevalence of big, really big landowners, right? Exactly the aristocracy that we were talking about now. That was developing also very interestingly a kind of proto-national character for reasons that were naturally beneficial to themselves, right? These kingdoms in many ways were still based on, in fact, on the idea of balance, of inclusion in many ways, because the more communities you put inside and the more you could the situation was fragmented, you could rule it from the above. That was the real thing, while the hard stock and the backbone that was fighting against this centralization was naturally the local aristocracy. So these big landowners that actually could be even not really ethnical in origin. I think about, for example, the aristocracy of Bohemia or of Hungary, but also, going far east, it's even difficult to say. These were pretty heavily mixed populations. Also, together with one of the steppes, the migration era ends much later. Everything ends much later in the east compared to certain developments that were happening in the west, by taking different turns. But also because these monarchies had often, the kings had invited foreign aristocrats to settle into their territories. We will see this essentially from the 14th century. There are entire Western dynasties that will sit on this large, let's say Eastern, at this point to simplify, kingdoms, right? But they're always, in this sense, these kingdoms become elective because it was the same aristocracy that called them. But previously to this, when there were still ethnic dynasties like the Arpads in Hungary or the Przemyslids in Bohemia or the Piast in Poland, the effort had been, in a certain sense, to attract foreigners, even as knights. A kingdom like Bohemia or Hungary could attract knights as from the west, as far as like England, Spain, Italy. Mostly they were Germans, telling the truth, and because it's obvious Germany is right there. But that could create a competitive. A new competitive aristocracy, faithful to the king, loyal to the king, against the ethnic aristocracy that now was already kind of settled down in a fashion that basically considered its own privileges untouchable, right? He said, if you have, and this is particularly interesting in Eastern Europe because you can find both in everywhere, like in Hungary, in Poland, in Russia, even entire populations from the Eurasian steppes settled in these countries on purpose with the royal approval to form kind of new royal armies. It's the case of the Hungarians, for example, with the Cumans that were basically fleeing the Mongol invasions from the east and taking refuge into these lands and becoming sort of proteges of the kings. And that was very convenient to do. We have seen it. It was happening literally everywhere. It was happening even during the Crusades, at having even people coming from different religions. These Cumans were pagans, incidentally. All these other Slavic kingdoms were, Hungary is not completely Slavic, but you understand what I'm saying. Were Christianized. They could, however, coexist in there like an entity that, for that very reason, depended exclusively on the king, because if the king had not protected them, the rest of the ethnic aristocracy would have wiped them out. It's the same thing, for example, I don't know, where in the Kingdom of Sicily, when you find Frederick II of Hohenstaufen that has a Saracen guard, right? And the reason why the Saracens were so effective and so faithful in his army was exactly because the Kingdom of Sicily was a Christian kingdom, and if there hadn't been the king there protecting these guys, they would have been annihilated, as by the way, it would happen when the Angevins came. Initially, they even used the Saracens, then they wiped them out when they don't need it. didn't need them anymore. But it's really the ethnic aristocracy, the greater problem for the centralization of these kingdoms from an institutional point of view, because obviously these guys do not want to basically have anything to do with a more centralized direction of the state. They want to contribute. They largely try to build their own fortune on their own. There is a great privatistic understanding. If you take, we made several videos even about the Polish military. It was really during the early modern age, but it's somehow comparable now to the late Middle Ages, where you find that these guys had enormous armies, private armies on their own, even with, you know, real armies, like with artillery and everything, you know, that were altogether even stronger than the monarchy, and that simply fought on their own or against external enemies if they were on the frontier, but basically they didn't give a damn about creating a more centralized asset. And that's a kind of mistaken direction in history, because eventually these kingdoms will fail politically and militarily, while those who prevailed in Europe eventually were the ones that had this kind of Western model. And I stress this because, for example, this is what happened with Russia in the early 18th century. They westernized in a way that make Russia becoming, you know, going past the ancient kind of dynastic and aristocratic ideal towards a more centralized, at least for Russian standards, address on the copy at that point, on the model of the Westerners, right? So there is always this interesting relation and a very shaded background in this sense, because if you take even a country like Germany or the Holy Roman Empire as a whole, where you realize that there wasn't a central direction, right? Even the same kingdom of Bohemia was part of the Holy Roman Empire at this point. It was, in this sense, between West and East. Even in kingdoms like the one of Poland, there were substantial differences between the western side and the eastern side, even within the same kingdoms. So, and even more in the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, as you understand. So, there is really a geographical dimension in which you can measure these changes, right? And the power of these nobles is enormous. They can't really counter the royal action. It's very difficult for kings to make some progress towards the direction of centralization, and the best they can do is, in fact, to kind of entice all these various families to say, okay, you know, I make you participate to this enterprise, I give you privileges, etc., all within the feudal tradition, but trying to maybe favor some and weaken others, but then always checking that the one they had power, they didn't become overpowered. And you understand this is not really the best way to operate, but they were largely without great you know, possibilities. Many people say, oh yeah, if I had been king at the time, I would have simply centralized. Well, good luck with that. Go there and try to do it and see what happens. You know, risk of rebellions, major warfare within the borders, of disruption. So it was a real problem. And consider also that war, in from this point of view, really probably played a great role in maintaining, even in shape, certain monarchies for so long, right? So the idea that even from the aristocratic perspective, that the kingdom had to exist was definitely present. You know, these aristocrats didn't want their kingdoms to disappear. They weren't actively countering the disgregation of the kingdom in itself, at least tendentially, because naturally there were noblemen that were a bit like in the middle of the situation, maybe on the borders, on the frontier, or maybe having even different cultural characters, because there was a bit of a diversity within the same borders. And this is particularly evident. Think about all the German communities that existed, or in fact all these hybrid character. Think about Bohemia. You know, all the Germans that lived in there, certain areas were heavily Germanized. There were other ethnicities living within the boundaries. So it was very complicated. But I don't remember where I was going with. Oh yeah, the fact that aristocrats, however, would never renounce to the central authority of a king. First of all, because they could become kings themselves, and a great part of their activity was exactly based on the internal competition between the other oligarchs to rise to the throne, right? And this was so intense that in fact brought to the call of external dynasties, because nobody within the kingdom wanted the local any other local aristocrat to prevail. So it was better to call someone from the outside that in this sense didn't have quite strong bonds locally, so it could theoretically be a bit more like a entrusted tasks rather than asking the nobility to. And naturally also in here the picture is much more complicated, but the noblemen needed a legitimizing authority because they were fundamentally framed in the institutions of the kingdom. In this way, if the kingdom is not centralized, it means that it has to work with the aristocrats. It has to entrust them tasks and has to reward them with titles and giving them places of power that were recognized by the sovereign authority. Right? And these kingdoms at this point, especially in the late Middle Ages, were already well defined in this sense. So it was practically impossible at the time to wipe them out, saying, okay, well, let's assume that a foreign ruler conquers the kingdom. There is no destruction, but rather substitution, right? And that's also why so many foreign monarchies existed at the point, and always at the time. And always bear in mind matrimonial strategies, right? And we will see now that they were particularly important because still these kingdoms were, albeit trying to somewhat centralize, were all functioning on a feudal base. So naturally the various inheritances could mean great. I mean, if you were to list all the various marriage ties between Poland, Bohemia, Hungary, it's a total mess. But proof is that at the end of the story of all these dynastic unions that happened, a lot, with all with others, Bohemia with Poland, Poland with Hungary, Hungary with Bohemia, and all, etc. These things remained always kind of alone. The same goes for the Scandinavian countries, right? And I would like to stress one thing more is about the aristocracies, is that they were part of a sort of cultural disruption, if you want. I mean, while in the West there were new monarchies, especially from the late Middle Ages, rising with a quite clear direction of what centralization, I mean a clear awareness of what centralized direction was, politically speaking, that could build therefore the idea of a solid institution of robust administrative apparatuses and a permanent military that is starting to happen here. These other kingdoms basically saw the private privilege as an institutional right, so something that couldn't be surpassed by definition, because the excuse was like at the very origins of the Indo-Europeans, like the idea we are all free, right, which is a beautiful thing, we are all free, yay. But unfortunately that was used as a way instead not to be free, but actually to let those oligarchs doing whatever the heck they liked in their own lands without having to respond to anyone, and in the meanwhile trying always to subdue each other, and therefore freedom just namely, right? So there are many things you can do in the name of freedom that sometimes are not really what these apparent intentions would suggest. And I would say, in fact, that especially in Eastern Europe, I think in part also in Scandinavia, was an extreme and brutal contempt, for example. It was a bit proper of all, let's say, oligarchies during the Middle Ages towards the peasantry. Like, the peasantry were conceived like simple, like dogs, basically, like subhuman entities, like animals, right? And I'm literal about this. These are old prejudices that existed, actually, both in the feudal elites, but also in the urban elites towards the peasantry. So even this, when we talk about proto-national identities, that is a topic that also we have to touch now. We look at this prestigious, like the Szlachta in Poland, or this the ethnic of this country, of this, we all belong to this kind of nation. Well, as a matter of fact, these people didn't give a freaking damn about their own, let's say, connationals that worked for them or had there was this very deep contempt towards the peasantry, and this great division that more than ethnical was actually classist in some ways. Like I was discussing about it rightly today, for example, that the great divisions that even were stressed sometimes as national movements, like the Hussites, etc., were not national. They were mostly like a class fight between maybe the ethnic nobility and the establishment, like in the case of Bohemia, like with the kind of Germanized establishment of the Luxembourg dynasty, that the historiography wanted for some time to depict, like, the Czechs versus the Germans, but it wasn't at all like that, and it seems that there was ethnic differences were meaningless in front of what really the class, like, let's call it in this way, differences really were. What was at the top? It was a clash between elites. It was instrumentalized in a way. It would appear like the liberation of that country from the foreigners, but it wasn't quite like that. Especially Bohemia is a quite happy proof, actually, of the serene and plurisecular coexistence of Germans and Czechs, for example, and this is valid actually for great part of the Ancien regime, for other countries, and this is always important, right? Because especially if those classes are particularly useful, like they are merchants, they're people who are enterprising. In Bohemia, there were the miners that were particularly important. You really need those people. You can make money, and it's the same crown that says, okay, you know what, we need these guys to stay here. Naturally, the topic is a bit more complicated, but you can give that. It can have this. It can be interpreted at least in this way. So, talking about Scandinavia and the kingdoms, especially of Sweden and Norway. So, Scandinavia proper were fundamentally weakened throughout all this period by a strong internal conflictuality, right? They couldn't assume any sovereign regional role. They were small kingdoms, were fairly limited in resources, and they struggled in order to give themselves a unitary direction, right? More dynamic, actually, was instead the action of the Danish kingdom, the kingdom of Denmark, that historically speaking had been the most developed, right? And always here remember why, right? Always remember it's kind of closer to civilization. It's also warmer, presumably, but these things matter. That's the reason why, for example, I don't know, Bohemia or Hungary were overall more functional systems than Poland, right? Because there is really a distance from civilization, and remember that at this time Europe is not enclosed. European countries are not enclosed on themselves. Here, scholars, teachers, architects, scientists, mercenaries, contractors, engineers travel all over Europe. There is a huge regional, international quest for craftsmen, and think about all these countries we're looking at, the military developments, also the rest of Europe, taking engineers. This time we are in humanism, in the Renaissance. A lot of people from Italy that literally built, fortresses that make certain works of engineering, because it was really believed, and they were settled. These people were invited in to share certain places of power and prestige, because these were important assets these people were really worthy a lot and could help the monarchies in this process of strengthening of their own prerogatives, even internally speaking. But even the Kingdom of Denmark, going back to Scandinavia, and in general, also the Scandinavian countries were, of course, Denmark is not in Scandinavia; it's in the Jutland. But let's call Sweden, Norway, and Denmark probably this northern monarchies. Let's call it in this way better. Were, however, stemmed. This is a very important chapter by the military and commercial strength of the German maritime cities. Right, these were tied among each other by an association known as the Hansa, as you know, it is this league, and it was a great commercial society, if you want, maybe simplistically meant in this way, because theoretically it was also a political alliance. The most important cities in northern Germany were Lübeck, Hamburg, and Bremen, and all these cities really didn't like each other very much, but they constituted this league to consolidate their commercial privileges, both in the Baltic Sea and in the North Sea. These were very important directions of development. At this time, as you know, the Baltic Crusades were pioneered by not just by the Teutonic Order as such, these warrior monks, but also of the German merchants and settlers that literally expanded even this feudalized Western model of land exploitation, of social organization towards the east. Between the Baltic Sea and the North Sea, there were intense traffics. England starts to trade extensively with the Baltic Sea, so and German traders are well present in the English trade centers. So the idea was the following: that usually, these were all like city-states, like they were all small cities on their own. Right? And we will see now a bit better what it was about. So what happened is that they normally traded with other kingdoms. England was a good market, but very often, as it happens to all great kingdoms that at this time are chronically short of money, every once in a while the kings say, you know what, well, we don't have money to pay the loans that we made. This happened all the time. It also triggers some of the worst financial catastrophes in the Middle Ages. So what we do is, at one point where we need really to cash fast, is that we basically seize all of the goods of your merchants in our kingdom, and we keep them for themselves. So as long as this happened for individual cities, like, it was difficult for the individual city to go against the whole freaking kingdom of England, right? But if they were all together, they could really cause a great damage, for which if only one city of the Hansa was, this sense, disadvantaged by, I said, the kingdom of England, but it could really be other of these other northern kingdoms or even others. In the whole Hansa would say, you know what, I don't trade anymore with you. And we don't care, because these cities were very wealthy on their own, so they could well manage their businesses, while the kingdoms had much larger, investments normally in the military, also in the strengthening of their states, in fact, at this point. And therefore they would have lost too much. So this was a very clever way to for these maritime cities to maintain their freedom, their power. And the same Hanseatic League, it was active in the 13th century, even before he expanded into the following century, and in 1377 also his preeminence in England was recognized, and it's not a surprise really that its power started to fade in the second half of the 15th century. Why did the Hansa spread so much, for example, at that point? Well, there were a reason. In fact, the weakness of the northern monarchies and the same German monarchy, right? The Hanseatic League was also geographically in this area where in Germany, the greatest powers in Germany were normally in the south, especially at this point. The greatest dynasties in Germany were like the Habsburgs, were the Wittelsbachs, partly the Luxembourgs, but were, let's say, more close to France, and eventually they seized the kingdom of Bohemia. The north was, let's say, floating. Obviously, there were powerful dynasties in there too, but much less powerful, as a matter of fact. From the other side of the sea, in the north, these northern kingdoms are substantially weak. So these cities make a huge fortune because of this weakness, and they become to decline exactly while, especially the northern kingdoms, strengthen themselves more, right? And this is particularly interesting because eventually many people think that the Hanseatic League was kind of a unitary thing, like, yeah, all several cities, but all kind of concord and happy and cooperative, but it wasn't really like that. There were many differences between the same Hanseatic leagues, the Hanseatic cities, sorry, that were based on regional differences. First of all, the leading cities we mentioned before were very competitive, the one with the other. They were fairly distant, meaning that, Bremen is not Lübeck, evidently, and they also bonded with terrestrial powers in the German mainland that that were in fact backing each other, also trying to create division within the same league. So there were conflicts within the same league, but at the same time, at that point in history, the trade and investment in commercial activities in general paid well. So there was really no reason to really destroy this thing, as long as at one point these external kingdoms start to interfere too heavily, and they have to surrender themselves. But like the Hanseatic League was pretty aggressive. It came to assault even the major cities in Denmark. I mean, it was a big thing. They expanded in Sweden. I mean, had a really great commercial penetration capability, and so on. But there remained cities. For example, they didn't give rise to states on their own. For example, if you take in the south of Europe, with the Italian maritime republics instead, you find in there that these cities were individually stronger and could form even states on their own. Like take Venice, or just an example, or Genoa, that are the most famous ones. But those could really work as states on their own. They were the most powerful around there. The Hanseatic League was instead this huge block of so many centers that were also more difficultly manageable in a unique institutional fashion, right? So it was a quite precarious balance that ended at the end of the Middle Ages, together with the overall, also because of these external factors. So the northern kingdoms felt some sort of let's say of similarity among each other. The crowns of Sweden, Norway, and Denmark were often united for dynastic reasons. However, no monarch really managed to give stability to, first of all, their own kingdom, his own kingdom, and to launch a true administrative and institutional reorganization, right? On the contrary, the northern kingdoms were characterized by the introduction of feudal institution, exactly in an age where in other countries in Western Europe these were being limited, or at least put into discussion, right? Just the other day we were talking about the very slow passage from, let's say, let's say the process of feudalization of the Nordic world. It was extremely slow, right? So these institutions were weaker inherently, right? And it was very different. Even in the north, for example, cities were fundamentally weak. Even the communal state there were communes in the north, in these Nordic kingdoms, but sometimes there were just a bunch of villages that formed a sort of league together to be recognized, a communal status that they could use against other territorial entities, but they weren't quite like cities, right? You know, there was a few in there in Scandinavia, and this contributed also to, you know, to make to the development of aristocracy in this sense, because there was no strong force from the bottom of society at that point that could build something alternative that could be exploited by the monarchy in an aristocratic in an anti-aristocratic direction in order to centralize. But it's definitely worth of the mention the Union of Kalmar, as that probably you all know. It's the story that proves many of these dynamics. In 1388, Margaret, Queen of Denmark, had married the Norwegian King Haakon VI, and after his death in 1380, and the death of the son Olaf in 1387, Margaret governed Denmark and Norway. For this reason, was a much usually a stronger connection between Denmark and Norway, as you know, historically speaking. But at this point, she was acclaimed as Queen of Sweden as well, by a part, let's say, of Swedish nobility that had rebelled against the Swedish King Albert of Mecklenburg. Right? Even in here, you see that Mecklenburg was, for example, as you know, northeastern German power that interfered also in here. In dynastically speaking, was normal in this broader net of royalty to create these larger nets, and exactly to centralize, because this was the connection, is that if you couldn't really expand within your own kingdom, you could hope to seize other kingdoms through matrimonial strategies, and collecting a bit of resources from of surplus from all of them. You could invest them in here and there to try to centralize maybe the internal institutions, monarchical institutions of one single kingdom, right? And Albert of Mecklenburg was defeated in the Battle of Falun in 1389. So at this point, Margaret remained effective ruler of the three Scandinavian kingdoms, right? And the king was formally instead the great nephew, I think, of Queen Margaret. It was Henry of Pomerania, also in here Pomerania, a region of the Baltic Sea from the continental side, and Henry was in fact elected King of Norway in 1387, and of Denmark and Sweden in 1397, and this was a formidable event, because basically there was a single lineage that had united dynastically all the Scandinavian all three Scandinavian kingdoms. So the Kalmar Union, Kalmarunionen, then that in June 1389 recognized juridically the union, and more specifically the perpetual union in one single sovereign of the three royal dignities of Denmark, Sweden and Norway, right? So on June the 17th, Henry of Pomerania was consecrated as king. And what is interesting about this experiment, naturally the history is very complicated, we don't have the time to look at it in detail, but is that this power, this union, remained up to Henry's death into the hands of Margaret. That was the mind behind the act of union, and this naturally was not really unequal. Like, it was basically Denmark having this accentuated prevalence over the other kingdoms, and there were lots of rebellions, in fact, into this system. Also, the capability of factual control of all the kingdoms were pretty low. But in spite of this momentaneous interruptions and internal struggles. The Kalmar Union lasted until 1523, when it was definitely infringed by the revolt of the Swedes, guided by Gustav Vasa, right? So this is really interesting because it makes you understand that there was some interest in general to unite kingdoms, but the forces within them would simply go into other directions. I mean, if you couldn't have really solid kingdoms on your own, how could you think to make work multiple kingdoms together, right? Unless there are very strong motives like a common enemy, etc. But here the situation was constantly floating, like swinging. So yes, so looking back at Eastern Europe, so this region and its territorial assets and balances knew between the 14th and the 15th century what you can call like radical changes, right? Talking about the Balkans, today we don't concentrate much about the Balkans, and I realize I have to make up for this one day, because we will have to look in detail also at that. But the major event at the end of the Middle Ages is the Ottoman invasion, right? So this is really a big change throughout all the Balkans had undergone, especially in the south, in the previous centuries, especially with the conquest of Constantinople and the creation of the Latin Empire, etc., had really changed a lot of things. The Byzantines also previously had tried to expand further in the Balkans. The Balkans are also very difficult ground for empires. There is a lot of room, and not definitely an easy one to go through, between the Danube, for example, and the Aegean Sea. Very difficult ground. This is what the Ottomans learned also the hard way on their own. But fundamentally, Ottoman invasion brings first to the collapse of the Serbian kingdom, and eventually to the same end of the Byzantine Empire as we know it. So the Turks sweep into the Balkans, and this creates naturally great alarm, also because it's a very rapid advance, as you know. It's halted actually on multiple occasions, and it could be reversed up to a certain point. And also the realistic threat of the Ottoman Empire to the whole Europe is doesn't have to be exaggerated for anybody who has a realistic, some sort of accurate understanding of more or less what the capabilities of these formations were, in spite of the Ottomans were really very powerful. So in a broader perspective, you can see that Balkanic history is influenced still today by these moments, and the Balkans became a region of political, cultural, and religious border, a real frontier between the Muslim and the Christian world. And from the Christian side, the bulwarks, the avant-posts, were Hungary, and in perspective Bohemia. Then there were these other, as you know, also what would be today's Romania was this somewhat fragmented area that were partly under Hungary. So in the east, of Hungary itself, the Hungarian kingdom, then there was Wallachia, then Moldova, etc. So these were those were areas that never quite formed a unitary system, but that managed to carve basically their own niche, also to remain fundamentally pretty autonomous from Ottoman power, sometimes also siding with it, together with also naturally struggling bitterly against it, but also terrible grounds there too. But obviously the main interest of the Ottomans was pushing towards the northwest more than else. So Bohemia and Hungary were peculiar in this sense, because were let's say, two were framed, let's say, in a different political context than other Central Eastern European countries. Like, they were the only ones in this area to assume a organizational physiognomy similar to the one of Western kingdoms. This is particularly important. So let's see why. So talking about Bohemia first, Bohemia, as you know, was part of the Western Empire, the Germanic Empire, since Ottonian times, right? Which means that it was framed initially, if anything, by geographical proximity, eventually also from an institutional point of view. Bohemia was first recognized as a duchy, eventually becomes a kingdom within the Holy Roman Empire. In itself, it also becomes an elector of the Holy Roman Empire, so it has a really great importance. And especially during the 14th century, the second half of the 14th century reached great splendor under the dynasty of the Luxembourgs. But in this sense, Bohemia had known a quite long and fairly prosperous past under the Premislids that had tried back in the day to give a central asset to Bohemia. Also in here, the Premislids had similar problems to the other kingdoms. They basically struggled against the nobility. Also, you know that within the Bohemian kingdom, from one side there are there is Moravia as well, that never quite liked it, also this attempt of centralization. Bohemia was, however, more than all these other Central and European kingdoms, the most influenced by Western models, by especially the Germanic ones, and therefore it worked kind of better to form a more centralized directions. As you know, the Germany in itself would fail as a centralized state. So Germany is very interesting because it could be framed in part within this broader Central European world, because sometimes we in this, let's say, Eastern world, if you want, there's something that is very difficult to frame even with words, because what is that we mean exactly with Central Europe, Mitteleuropa, or Eastern Europe? It's very difficult to find a boundary, simply because there is no boundary, really. You know, from Germany to the east, there is no evident border at one point. You can, the Pripyat marshes, maybe, you know, with Russia is kind of another thing, but it's still kind of an open world. And Germany is considered naturally today, we still live of the Cold War, right? So Germany for us is West. And whatever is East, right? But this is, here we're talking about the Middle Ages. There is no even clear cultural concept of Europe in itself. So what is forming here should be considered step by step on the base of every local characteristic, every local identity and development, etc. But let's say that Bohemia works dramatically well. It's even able to expand using cities. You know, under Ottokar II, the Bohemians expand. They even seize Austria, and they arrive even up to the Adriatic Sea. So there is this fast expansion in which cities were dramatically important to counterbalance the aristocratic push, and were helping the monarchy, were recognized many city rights, etc. Bohemia also has these mines, you know, lots of interesting assets. Eventually, the Habsburgs defeat the Premislids, 1278, the Battle of Markfeld, and the Habsburgs get into Austria to stay. Right? They enter actually this game that had always existed there, with the Duchy of Austria and from Hungary from one side, Bohemia from the other. So it's a very, it doesn't stop there. There's the Habsburgs that came from basically from Alsace, from Switzerland. They enter into this kind of Eastern game of. There are beautiful places all around there, by the way. The borders between Austria, Hungary, Slovakia, Czech Republic, they're very fascinating. With a lot of warfare going on out there. It's very beautiful to visit. And the so at this point, Bohemia is a bit redimensioned. It suffers its own losses. The Habsburgs initially between the end of the 13th century and the beginning of the 14th have a huge expansion. They are recognized at one point even as lords in not just in Bohemia but even in Poland. I mean, something enormous that obviously is just nominal. But at this point, the Luxembourgs enter into Bohemia, in part to counter the Habsburgs, right? And in fact, Bohemia becomes, especially under Charles IV, this great nation. It's the heart of 14th century Europe, like with Prague especially, that not surprisingly is now a true capital, right? That is developed urbanistically speaking by royal power, right? That it becomes the base of a institutional and administrative organization. It becomes a wide cultural centers. The most refined literate come from all over Europe at Prague. It's a moment of great splendor. But also in here, it's always a situation of compromise. So now I'm kind of sad to skip everything in so speedily, but we will have to deal with every single one of these topics in another videos, in other dedicated videos. What happens is that there is this further strengthening. I mean, there is the rise of a certain German or Germanized aristocracy that also in here is very difficult to frame into certain key positions of the kingdom, both among the laymen and the ecclesiastics. So the national vulgata would be that this caused eventually things like the rebellions, like with Jan Hus, then eventually the Hasidic revolt, but this is really not a national thing. I mean, the idea is also here always the elite. Like, as far as I know, here it's the Bohemian elite that decides that has been kind of outbalanced by the Luxembourg, the clienteles of the external, even foreign sometimes clienteles of the Luxembourgs, and therefore they probably push eventually to portray their rebellion as a kind of a national character, but it's just by name, right? And there are also, however, certain popular components in this process that definitely participate, and it's interesting to look in general at the polemic of Jan Hus, professor at University of Prague, against the mundanization of the high clergy in prevalence German, but it was not really about that. Jan Hus, as you know, would die tragically at the stake, condemned at the stake at the Council of Constance in 1415, and this became kind of a symbol of this Bohemian identity, after all. So it, in a similar way, a similar evolution to Bohemia was the one of the Kingdom of Hungary as well. So you know that the Kingdom of Hungary also basically gravitates around the west more than the east, especially when from the 10th century as well. The Ottonians really do a lot to frame Hungary and Bohemia and also even Poland into this substantial Western sphere that is also the one of the Roman Church. Never to forget, these are all Catholic countries, and this is not to be given for granted, because at this time the Byzantines are expanding. They're successfully evangelizing the properly eastern side of Europe. So the two churches battle over, and it passes also through arms. As you know, the Hungars are defeated by the Ottonians, and they basically settle down. They stop launching raids, and Hungary looks upon the German model with great interest and respect, also because as warriors they were defeated, so they had to absorb, to accept this defeat also, that from someone who had to teach them something at the end of the day. So Hungary undergoes this process of strengthening, and it becomes actually a great power. Like, it's always also close to the Byzantines. It receives Eastern influences, but also Western ones. And it kind of it happens something similar to what we were saying at the beginning, that the the traditional semi-nomadic Hungarian aristocracy settles down, and this creates immediately problems to the king, that initially is still this leader of the people, like this great warrior, but that eventually transforms into a king, like in the West it was, in a more institutionalized and sanitarized base. And this requires, and this makes naturally losing a lot of power to him, because as long as the people was a nomadic one that could leave out of loot, sacking half of Europe with its marauderies, the leadership was necessary. As a military leader, there had to be someone capable, recognized. As long as he made the people winning, he was in place. But once that the aristocracy settles down, and it kind of, and obviously blends with the local population, it becomes a sedentarized aristocracy with castles, with land, and it's difficult to overthrow and to control it, right? So there are these big oligarchs also in Hungary that, as we have seen, the king tries to counter with Western knights settled into Hungary to become more loyal to the king. Asiatic populations like the Cumans, that every once in a while they arrived and they're sedentarized and there to form a kind of a royal army that waged war. Also in here, more like a model of the steppe than other. Remember here that also in these countries, especially in Hungary, it's very strongly accentuated this nomadic legacy of the past. Like even the models of authority, of command, of leadership are based on the idea that this ideally were the peoples, the warriors, the cavalrymen coming from the steppes, right? So this was partly also what had shaped the local identity, culturally speaking. So this thing continues, and Hungary suffers this very heavy shock of the Mongol invasions that really invest the country, and therefore Hungary up to that point had managed to equilibrate itself a little bit, but this event is traumatic. Difficulties continue, and in 1380, after very complex dynastic questions, there is a further westernization, because effectively the Anjou come to rule into Hungary, and for certain decades Hungary eventually will be held by the House of Luxembourg, right? And the Anjou during the 14th century, the Angevins first of all bring Hungary into this broader net of contacts. Like the Angevins at this point, actually a bit early, because the contacts with Hungary really begin much earlier. But if I'm not wrong, at the beginning of the 14th century. But as you know, the Angevins were very powerful. They wanted to create a sort of broader empire, between France and Mediterranean, and they had Naples, and they had parts of Greece. So Hungary was important also in this role. The Hungarian king also goes to fight for the throne in Naples, etc. By the way, also what I wanted to say is that Hungary becomes a great power that also is more than a kingdom, in my opinion, because it's more like an empire. Hungary is, well, let's say, identifiable, also geographically speaking, in a certain sense, but it's able to extend its power all around. Like if you look at a map of the Kingdom of Hungary at the time, it's pretty damn huge, right? Naturally, also in here, especially in the outskirts, is the actual control is nominal, right? But there is this idea that the attached to the king, the title of king, there is, I don't know, a duke of this, count of that, king of this other thing. I mean, it's really a great puzzle of elements that of a great empire that's being held together. I would like to deepen this perspective, also given the nomadic past, let's say, of the Hungars and this political models that Hungary had therefore received a bit, like, you know, the idea that there has to be a broader area from which to launch effectively raids and to control and to have this deterrence on. And as you know, Hungary eventually will also have these unions with Bohemia. There is a complicated stories in here. It becomes the bulwark against the Ottoman advance. Hungary is able to stem the Ottomans on the Danube line for quite a long time. Eventually they will collapse, and as you know, Hungary will be conquered at the beginning, in the first half of the 16th century, and will have but it's one of the great entities in Europe that is fairly overlooked, in my opinion. It should be considered more, especially in this period. And always consider here the geography. This is the Danubian plain, like the Pannonian plain in Central Europe, north of the Balkans, right? So this wide area, which originally these peoples like the Avars and then the Hungars had come because it's basically still part of the steppe, right? It's not a surprise that also these Cumans take refuge in Hungary, because it's really a large fertile plain for make horses pasture, etc. So and it's a power that expands, also contends with Venice on the Dalmatian coast. It next Croatia. It has these ambitions in the Carpathians, etc. So whatever. So passing to Poland and the Kingdom of Poland and the Grand Duchy of Lithuania. These are by far the larger states in Eastern Europe between the 14th and the 15th century. However, also in here we are in front of two entities, say statal entities, that are very fluid, right? Very changeable from a territorial point of view. The Kingdom of Poland finds its unity only at the beginning of the 14th century, thanks also to the backing of the support of the Roman Church, that had all the interests to see the consolidation of a Catholic avampost in a European East that was permanently Greek Orthodox in faith, right? Poland had started before, like in the 10th century, in the 11th century. The Piast dynasty had, however, fragmented. There were very few occasions in which all these various duchies that composed Poland effectively came together to form a unique entity. So it's really from the fact, as we've said, from the beginning of the 14th century, there is a progressive consolidation. As we said before, Poland had immediately fitted into the Roman sphere, right? So they are Catholic from an early age, and they immediately take clearly the decision of siding with the West, also for immediate reasons of defense. Like by converting to Catholicism, they would have they were too distant actually from Constantinople to convert to Orthodoxy, but as Denmark, for example, they convert to Christianity because they feared German expansion. So they said, okay, we declare ourselves acceptable on the international level by converting to Christianity in the first place, because that was really the problem, and started to consolidate. Remember always that the Christianization brings with itself the episcopal structure and hierarchy that help to structure in turn the same monarchy, right? The church is the great ally of monarchy at this point, because it can control it better from Rome, but at the same time, also locally speaking, it's the monarchy that can control the church, getting more resources and to frame and to control the various districts. So it's particularly important. Remember, as we were saying before, that these were areas where, you know, there was basically nothing, like in terms of urbanization and of this infrastructures up to an early age. That, like, yeah, of course, there were villages and fortified towns, etc., but it didn't go much further than that. So even building a districtuation based on dioceses, etc., building churches and castles is something that starts only at this time as a net to control wide areas that, however, in the case of Poland especially, never quite find a substantial balance, right, for a long time. Lithuania the Grand Duchy of Lithuania had even a lesser unity in some sense, and it was mainly had mainly arisen because of external pressure, especially from the side of the Russians of Novgorod, the aggression of the Russians of Novgorod, and eventually of the warrior monks of the Teutonic Order. Right. So this entity, as you know, many peoples of the Baltic area were literally wiped out, especially by the Teutonics. So the Lithuanians instead resist. They also live in a pretty damn tough land that is very difficult to penetrate in the first place. The Teutonic Order mostly develops along the coast, where it can be supplied by the Hanseatic cities, and doesn't need many terrestrial connections, because the mainland is really a mess. It's cold, it's covered in swamps and in forests, and these guys that live in there really are not very friendly. So the order holds in there. In the construction, by the way, of a state that was basically the most centralized entity in Eastern Europe, like the Teutonic state is born with an extremely efficient and rationalized and centralized direction, right? That was impressive for the time, partly because it was directed from this order on the models of. It was not a dynastic order, so it didn't develop as a normal feudal kingdom, but it also had the best in this sense of feudalism in terms of land exploitation, of organization, of economical potential, and etc. So the Lithuanians are also in here between two worlds. Like, Lithuania is kind of very east at this point, geographically speaking, so it's not really so close to civilization to develop something pretty centralized. Like, even Poland had tried to create what was legitimately a kingdom after all, with a ducal system, but the Lithuania is a bit different. Lithuania is still tribally fragmented. So what really gives strength and life to the Grand Duchy as we know it at this point is the metus hostilis, right? It's this military threat that is constant and that makes the Lithuanians organize themselves around this basically set of small principalities that, however, are managed to join together, especially in a military function against the enemy threats. The Lithuanians remain pagan also for a very long time. Like, they convert only at the end of the 14th century, and at that point it was a very strong motivating factor, because all of their enemies were Christian at this point, but either the Orthodox Russians or the Catholic Teutonics. So at this point, religion is just like a political, let's say, a political indicator to say that the models to which Lithuania wants to be inspired by are different, and that become this, if you want, gluing factor as well, or at least this banner, probably better, that makes them resist. However, on the long run, they managed to create a Grand Duchy that has a lot of potential, and that can objectively profit from the union with other powers. So Lithuania is very, very fascinating because it basically swings between the east and the west. The Jagiellonians are embarrassed to choose whether to side with the Orthodox or with the Catholics, and it's a choice. I mean, they went close to join with Russia instead than Poland, very, very closely to that. And instead they choose Poland, right? They decide to fit into this Western sphere, and they convert to Catholicism, and they obtain as Jagiellonians, as the Jagiellonian dynasty, the Polish crown in 1386. So they give life to this broader Polish-Lithuanian state known as the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. What is interesting here is that the Poles basically give the crown to a Lithuanian sovereign. So also from here begins the phase of external monarchies, also in dynasties in Poland, but before there had been the Angevins as well, because the Angevins rule in Poland as well. But there was this tendency, however, that is confirmed with the Jagiellonians, for which Poland starts choosing foreign powers. And this was still a moment, by the way, in which the Polish monarchy could try to attempt more intensely a central direction. I mean, I'm convinced that up to the 17th century Poland could achieve that, but eventually the nobility took over, and at least in the balance, and there was nothing could be done, right? And that in the 18th century Poland becomes de facto a Russian protectorate. But throughout all their history, you know, these are centuries of great power, like from the Polish-Lithuanian Union during the 14th, the 15th, 16th, 17th century. This is basically the largest power. This enormous power, even geographically speaking. We're talking about enormous amounts of land and power. As you know, in 1410, the Poles defeat the Teutonics at the Battle of Tannenberg. And so there is this expansion, this disgregation also of Teutonic power, and this consolidation on other fronts. Also the Poles, as you know, will be crucial also to launch offensives, to stem the Ottoman penetration in the Black Sea area. But that's all another story that belongs to the early modern age more than anything else. So, talking finally about Russia. I made several videos at this point about these very topics, so I won't be repeating myself for very long, but if you want to go look medieval Russia playlist, I basically discuss in general, but still with certain degree of let's say of specificity, all the problems of the institutional evolution of the Russian principalities, the rise of Muscovy, and I think it's worth here to remind some aspects of it that are very interesting. So, what was Russia at this point, right? So, Russia had formed historically with this series of Slavic principalities, with also a sort of political and military direction and connection deriving from the Varangians, this Viking adventurers that basically intervene into Russia to settle the quarrels between the various Slavic princes, and that ended up to become a dynasty, the Rurik dynasty, that was, if you want, I mean, you can't really say it's a historical fiction, but there is a lot of, because actually Rurik existed, and we know it because he was a Viking that also was witness in France at the same time. It was defeated, he went to Russia, etc. But it was also in here a bit of an excuse to say, in this enormous area of Russia, from the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea, all these huge Russian rivers, waterways, that there was a kind of let's say, of common identity, or at least a shared political project that could keep all of these principalities together on the base of a alleged dynastic union of all the descendants of Rurik with these local aristocracies, Slavic aristocracies that looked at the idea of the Great Russia basically as a unique thing of all these principalities. They always remained divided, but theoretically were under the direction of the greater prince. That was the one of Kiev, right? Kiev was the most important Russian city at this point. It was a florid market. As you know, the Kievan Rus was able to launch offensives even up to Constantinople. It was a great power. It defeated the Khazars. There was a lot of also in here lots of intersections actually, because the Russians basically as an ethnic group migrated from the west, let's say, into this eastern, can say even plains, because if you travel, especially in latitude, there are huge differences, let's say, between the Ukrainian steppes and the Russian forests, or the when you approach the Arctic, area. It's an enormous area, and they partly naturally they blended with the previous the populations that already existed there. And this happened naturally during the migration era. We also don't know excessively much about it to tell it all. But let's say that since the second half of the 12th century, the Kievan Rus assumed the guiding role of the principal state of the Eastern Slavs. There's all very approximate definitions, but it kind of gives you the idea. And what was really the gluing factor of these principalities? Ways that they kept together? First of all, there was this is a very interesting question to answer. I'm not even sure, because I'm not an expert about Russia, but I believe that many people said it was a broader. There were motives of military defense. Well, in part yes, because of all these populations that, as we have seen, were surrounding that, to which these trade centers around along the major Russian rivers were threatened by. So also the neighbors were not so friendly, like Lithuania, even Poland, and other powers kind of were interfering. So there was a broader, probably shared or perceived identity, common identity, and kind of a geographical unity of some sort. Probably a lot of economical interests together, because the rivers go from north to south. Basically, all these channels can be connected, so not from east to west. So Russia develops in this sense at this point more in latitude than in longitude, right? And that's probably due to these factors as well. But really, Russia is very diverse at this point. There are many different principalities with many different characters and identities and political projects, etc. And it's even difficult to say where actually Russia stops or begins, especially in the east, but also in the west. It's fairly difficult. And Russia develops at this point in a quite consistent way, in fact, especially from an economical point of view. There are these great cities that develop because of trade, and there are sound, let's say powerful middle classes. That is something you do not find elsewhere in Eastern Europe as much as that. Probably you don't have to exaggerate it excessively, but let's say that these middle classes, the urban classes, manage to counter nobiliar power, so that these Russian principalities are all based around cities, where there is a prince that embodies, in this sense, the aristocratic direction, but there is also a sound presence of freemen, of burghers, of merchants that are able to counterbalance the powers. It's obvious that the more flourishing the single city is because of trade, and the more let's say there is definitely more power because Kiev is a proof of this, but also a kind of more check and balances for between the prince and these classes, right? So this system at the beginning of the 13th century was already kind of declining, right? You know, it was very difficult to find. But by the way, they had Christianized, so Christianization had become very important for one reason, and it was probably one of the greatest gluing factors of the Russians, is that the Russian church, naturally of Greek Orthodox, right, was at this point a further sanction of princely power. So the great seat, obviously, of the Russian church was Kiev, and this granted it an enormous prestige and power and incomes, etc. So the idea is that there was a sort of hierarchy, technically, you know, theoretically, let's say, thought, and then a reality was different, but it was very convenient for all of these princely dynasties that theoretically were already all deriving from the same original one, to maintain the fiction of unity, right? For the same exact reason we were saying before about the kingdoms. Like, the oligarchies were fighting against centralization, and in fact Russia here is all but centralized outside, you know, between the various principalities. But at the same time, it's very convenient for these princes to think that theoretically there is an over-ruler that has somehow the right of the great to rule over the great Rus, right? To direct the great Rus and to protect it, defend it, etc. So the great catastrophe happens in the 13th century because the Mongols arrive and raze everything to the ground, very simply. So this is like an atomic bomb at the time. Like, it's really it changes everything. Like, in Russian culture is dramatically, deeply and irreversibly modified by this event, which favors enormously the process of centralization, let's say, of dynastization and privatization of Russian institutional culture. In those videos I explained this better, but basically the core concept is that all those prosperous trade centers are wiped out. Russia becomes much more similar in political and military and social organization to the Mongols, the Tartars, that of whom they become basically a client state, a vassal state. Vassal states, actually, because the principalities are always more or less the same. Just they're basically under the khanate of the Golden Horde, to which they have to pay regular tribute and so on. So this is actually a great occasion for the princes, because the princes basically immediately absorb the Tartar power model of leadership, because it's obviously devoid of any compromise with all the other classes. I mean, in the Mongol world, there is just the warlord. Point. End of the story. There are no other classes that can compete with it, right? Unlike in Europe, it had been in Europe. So the princes take this opportunity of the collapse of trade, of all this big system that Russia had been before, to strengthen their own personal privileges and prerogatives. So this is, in a nutshell, how the picture in which the Muscovy arises. I talk about Muscovy because actually Moscow was actually a pretty insignificant center. Like, I think the first news we have about Moscow is like in the 13th century. It was one of the north, especially easternmost Russian centers. It was in a terrible place, by the way, from an environmental point of view. It was a very small power, kind of insignificant, but exactly under the Tartars, the princes of Muscovy manage to expand because they become basically the men of the Tartars that the Tartars rely on to basically to control the other Russians in part. Obviously it's very difficult. The Tartars never quite achieve the full control of Russia, but as long as they paid all tributes, everything was fine. And these were basically the men of the Russians, of the Mongols, sorry. So Moscow is possibly, of all the Russian principalities, the one that has the strongest, in absolute terms, the strongest Mongol influence in political and military models, right? So what we conceive as the rise of the Grand Duchy of Muscovy and modern Russia is basically grounded on this tradition. The opposite model is Novgorod, that is instead in far north and broadly west, because it's projected towards the Baltic Sea, which is instead a republic, right? It's Novgorod is really the example of a city where the princely power was weak because it was the merchant classes that ruled. So Novgorod is actually very similar a bit to the Hanseatic cities. Yeah, okay, it's different because it's not a German city. It has different origins, but it shares that kind of model, right? But it's a weak model because mercantile states really do not go very far into this meat grinder, and Moscow basically will rise enormously and will swallow this system that was very wealthy but had no chance, even especially in political and military organization, right? So the rise of Moscow is also here. We don't have time to go to it in detail, but it was a complex and very gradual process. Let's say, as we've seen here, it developed in the harbor of the Mongol protection. It rose especially from the 14th century, partly exploiting the same weakening of the Golden Horde, and progressively seizing with Vladimir also the leadership of the Russian Church, that at that point had become basically the bulwark, the identity here, the identity of Russia as a whole, right? Remember, the Mongols here were Muslims, right? The Russians remained obviously Christian, and that was arguably at that point the greatest, I think, in Russia, in the absence of any other truly unitary direction, aside from maybe some linguistical and ethnical commonalities. Really, it was the church that, especially from a political and institutional point of view, gave the authority to rule. And from the destruction of Kiev, the seat of the Russian Church had passed to Vladimir, and Vladimir is this other principality that is seized eventually, is conquered by the Muscovy. And as you know, there is all this great process. There is warfare. There's the Battle of Kulikovo, for example, in which the Russians defeat the Mongols. But even in here, the tides take a lot of time to turn. And in the process, by the way, there are lots of Mongol lords that joined the Russians. By the way, the Russians already used, even before the Mongols, even in their army, this local Turkic populations that they considered their own pagans, they called them this way to distinguish them from the Mongols of the far east of Mongolia, in fact. So it's a very complicated process, as long as you remember that to define it as an extremely aggressive one. Like Muscovy rises with a mindset that is dramatically authoritative. Like the princes of Moscow think of themselves to be the great, in fact, great tsars, like the great emperors of all Russia, of all the Russias, sometimes, as it's said, like of all the principalities of Russia, that they have to rule with iron fist, with a political military model that belongs to the steppes more than to the West, right? And this remember this, because this characterizes Russian policy and mindset for quite a long time, and it still has partly into it. Like, it's very important to remember how heavy the idea of the Khanate stands into Russian imperialism in this sense. So, as we've said before, Novgorod is very different otherwise. So, eventually, Moscow also takes in here all the possible ideological roles over. Like, Moscow becomes a capital, a center, as we were saying before, and it becomes it obtains prestige because it by the way it shifts the center of the seat of the Russian Church. So it also obtains this religious prestige that is everything at the time, because here religion is like basically a national identity, and not differently from the West, but here it's overloaded with even sometimes very dark, very bloody ideas of what power should really be about. It's a very dark story, but it's very fascinating and thought-provoking in this sense. So towards the end of the 15th century, Novgorod and great part of the lesser principalities are conquered by Ivan III, Ivan the Great, also known between 1462 and 1505, that in fact is considered the true founder of the Russian state, if you want, in a on a long modern perspective, in modern perspective also. So I don't know if I think this video was okay. I mean, I am fairly satisfied about how it turned, because I hope to have given a pattern of interpretation that, it's nothing original. I mean, these are widely known historiographical concepts, but I think it's important to talk about them, because frankly I think I've never heard, not even a single time, this stuff said anywhere, like in popular culture. I never hear it. Like, I hear only the history of this battle, this ruler, this battle, this ruler, and nothing else. Like, beyond in perspective, nothing. And you know that this channel talks about military history, and how passionate I am to talk about, especially battles, obviously, and also history of sovereignty is important, but it can't be done just like that. Like, it has to be a broader cultural perspective, because otherwise you can't understand even what that battle of that monarch really is. So, as I was saying before, I'm also creating these playlists dedicated to the various nations I talk about. For Russia, incidentally, at this point, I've made several videos already, but there is a very fascinating world that you can picture from these perceptions, in my opinion, that are very useful to understand history as a whole, and not just like the tiny thing. And that's also the reason why I embark myself into this endeavor of let's say of trying to speak in a single video about the northern monarchies, the eastern monarchies, etc. But I hope it kind of made sense. So for now, this is all. I hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming contents. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time, and see you next time. Bye.